with us this morning before starting a program for the day. Thank you very much. You can if you want to. Right, all right. Take your time. All right, our next commentator is Professor Syed Farid Alatas, whom I've already introduced to as the head of the Department of Malay Studies at the University of Singapore. I invite Professor Alatas now to address us and give his comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Pastor Yu, keynote speaker Dr. Ahmad Farouk, fellow commentators, and ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and peace to everyone. I will just begin my comments immediately. Now, what I notice, which I find very refreshing, is that in the past, it was common in Malaysia and in other multi-ethnic countries to criticize the idea of the Islamic State on the grounds that we are a multi-racial or multi-ethnic society, and therefore it is not appropriate to apply Islamic law to non-Muslims. Now, this I've always found to be a weak argument, because I think the stronger argument is that the idea of an Islamic State is problematic for Muslims as well. Now, what I mean is the idea of the scholars, of many scholars of Islam, their notion of the Islamic State and their interpretation of the Sharia is problematic for Muslims themselves. Now, as Dr. Ahmad rightly pointed out, the notion of Dawla Islamiyah or Islamic State does not occur in the Quran, but the conception of rule based on Sharia is unanimously agreed upon by the scholars or the ulama of Islam. However, the issue that is contested is what the Sharia means, how it is interpreted, and whether it defines the state or whether it is subordinate to something larger than rules, laws, and regulations. Whether the Sharia is subordinate to, shall we say, the spirituality and universal values of Islam. After all, when the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was working in his mission to bring Islam to mankind, he said that God had brought him to bring morality to mankind, not rules and regulations. The famous hadith of the Prophet, Inna Allahi ba'athani li'utammima makarim al-akhlaq wa kamali mahasin al-af'al. God has sent me to perfect the nobility of morality and the beauty of action. Now, obviously, I think all Malaysians know, and has been pointed out by many people, including our chairman earlier on, that there is a need for a state which deals with problems, whatever you call the state, Islamic or otherwise. Problems such as ethnic discrimination, corruption, inefficiency, crime, and so on and so forth. Now, if you want to call such a state an Islamic state, I'm very happy to do so. There would be no argument. And in that sense, a secular state can be an Islamic state if it is based on universal values and is fair to other religions. If that is what is meant by the Sharia as a code of conduct, then I think everybody would support the idea of an Islamic state. But not a state that is obsessed with hudud laws, which, by the way, as hudud laws have been conceived of by the early scholars of Islam, by many of the early scholars of Islam, does affect non-Muslims. For example, in the opinion of many jurists in the past, non-Muslims would be subject to various punishments, such as for adultery and so on and so forth. So the idea that non-Muslims are exempt from Islamic law is a fallacy. There is therefore a need to rethink what we mean by Islamic law, for example, hudud laws, is stoning to death part of Sharia? In the opinion of many scholars of Islam, it is actually something that is derived from Jewish law, and this is confirmed by Jewish, in fact, I spoke to a Jewish rabbi, an Orthodox Jewish rabbi about this. This is confirmed. But Muslim scholars themselves disagree about the extent, about whether it is part of Islamic law. The only kind of Islamic state for Malaysia is the one started or established by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by the so-called Constitution of Medina, founded on cooperation with and the rights of other religions such as the Christians and particularly the Jews. It is very interesting that this was the basis of the first Muslim state. It was founded based on a series of agreements that the Prophet made with the Jews and the Christians of Medina, in which they had, in many ways, more rights than minority religions have in Malaysia today. And finally, I would like to say, what is the most important is the spirit governing the state that we have. The Prophet Muhammad once said of a Jewish lady who, by the way, was a prostitute. She was a prostitute. But because he saw her act in a kind way to a dog was thirsty, she lowered her shoe into a well to draw some water and fed the dog the water. The Prophet said that she will be forgiven her sins. Can we have Islamic leaders with such a spiritual outlook on life? If we can have such Islamic leaders, then I am all for an Islamic state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alatas. If you have any questions on some of the views that he has expressed, including his view about what should be a proper Islamic state and the spirits and values he should espouse, that's something new, and whether that is possible. Keep your questions, don't lose them, and you can pose them specifically to him when question time comes about. Let me now move on and invite my colleague, Encik Malik Imtiaz, to address us. Malik? Oh, yes, go ahead. Yeah, for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Could I just say that I think it's a form of cruel and unusual punishment to restrict a lawyer to 5 minutes on a subject like this?
Like most lawyers, they are better on their feet than their bottom.
And I think Isaac will have to carry me off stage if he wants to stop me. All right. I agree with what's been said earlier, that this is possibly one of the most contentious issues in the country at the moment. What I don't understand is why. And what I find somewhat disconcerting about discussions or seminars like this, while I appreciate the sentiments of the speakers before me, all three of them, we tend to avoid or dodge the subject that we have a constitution. And that constitution was put in place in 1957. And in that constitution, it says that the constitution is the supreme law of the land. And that's the end of the discussion. And that should be the end of the discussion, really. All right. So, when we talk of this subject, and this is really my first point, when we talk of this subject, what we're actually doing is discussing whether we want to abide by constitutionalism or not. Because the conversation has gone from one which was about the Constitution from 1957 to about the mid-90s, when the Islamization campaign started more aggressively at the hands of UMNO, to one which is now, what is the social, the role of Islam in society? A revisionist perspective of constitutional law. In effect, a backdoor method to try and change the basic structure of the society. And that's really what the debate's about. And I think it's important to understand why it is that debate has started. And it started because, fundamentally, there was a wholesale disregard of the rule of law that took place from the 1980s. So much so that public administrators, our judges, and a wealth of public individuals just don't seem to get it that the line between politics and governance has been completely erased. So, in that sphere, and this takes me into my second point, in that sphere, ideologues have emerged. We have the somewhat, I was going to be rude and use a pejorative term, but I won't say that. We have this highly insightful ministers who say things in the newspapers all the time, some of them particularly remarkable. And you know, ultimately what it is that this society defines itself, it depends on what the NST decides to print on the front page of the paper. So, you know, if tomorrow Nazri says we're a bunch of Martians, well, so be it, you know, and we'll be discussing what the religion of Mars is. Because that's the reality of this. So the question is, in this context, and this is my second point, who are the victims? Who are the victims of this blurring of the lines? It's so easy to talk about how non-Muslims are affected by this so-called dominance. But what we tend to forget, that the biggest victims in this discussion are actually the Muslims themselves. Because everyone recognizes the freedom of non-Muslims. But people don't seem to want to talk about, and I note how artfully Nurul dodged the subject as well, about what it is that Muslims who have a particular view about the religion do. Right? Everyone dodges that. So the point is, diversity within the religion is as important as it is for us Muslims as it is for all of you. No one's going to stop you from going to a Catholic church or a Protestant church or whatever it is. But we're being told by the state there's only one version of Islam, and that's what the legislature is telling us under the hands of the Fatwa Council and the Majlis Agama. If you don't believe their kind of Islam, you're a deviationist. So that's the reality of it. So in that context then, what we have essentially is monolithic Islam being used for political purpose. And we're all the victims of that process. Because of race and religious rhetoric in politics, Islam has become a very, very important source of vote pulling or vote intimidation, etc. I'm sure some of what Nurul said today, and I'm sure the other member of the Pakatan who's going to speak, Dr. Rawa, I'm sure what they're going to say today is going to be twisted and turned to political end as well. But that's the reality, that at the end of the day, what we're actually dealing with is a political construct that has reduced religion into just this us and them discussion, and we don't give any credence to the nuances of the religion in any form. We don't give any credence to the idea that politics has encroached into the private spheres of all of us as Malaysians in a way that's completely repugnant to the Constitution, and we act as if the Constitution doesn't exist. And that's where we are. So I guess the third point I make now is we know how it came to pass. The question I have for those commentators that follow me is, what do we do to solve the problem? And in this context, I think the Islamic opposition, PAS, should come to understand that when they talk of hudud, it is not only fear of hudud that drives the discussion. It is also fear of a repeat of the kind of nonsense we're seeing now, where the apparatus of state is being used in the name of religion to actually exploit and abuse power. That all of us are being subjugated by forces that are called religious, but in actual fact are nothing more than extensions of the political impetus that drives them. And that is what we're concerned about. At the end of the day, Part 2 of the Constitution says that all of us can live our lives as we want to, in private. The Supreme Court upheld that principle in 1988. It said that the public sphere of this country is secular. That decision of the Supreme Court has never been reversed. The Constitution has not been amended since that. Both Dr. Cyrus and I have argued cases where we've said this repeatedly in the federal court. But somehow, when Nazri speaks, or Najib speaks, or whoever it is speaks, all of this doesn't seem to matter because it becomes a might is right scenario. And that cannot be accepted. So we know what's caused it. I guess we'll have to think about what we want to do to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik, and thank you for reminding us of the Federal Constitution. I had always thought that, legally speaking, this issue was settled back in 1957 when we started our journey as a nation. But there you are. There's always increased debate and new thoughts and attempts to revise things. But I suppose that's what a democracy is all about. And let me now move on and invite our next speaker to make his commentary. Also a lawyer, probably from a different perspective from the perspective Malik has given or the background of Malik. And this is Dato' Kenny Ng. Dr. Kenny?
Thank you, Dr. Chairman. If you think that politicians are long-winded, wait till you have lawyers taking the mic. Lawyers get the LLB enough for no reason. It means long, long breath. So, Dr. Chairman, I'm very much inclined to my fellow colleague Malik and the main speaker that presented his paper this morning. In response to that, I have only 2 points. One, as a non-Muslim now, in all humility, I always perceive that Islam is more than just a religion. Islam is very much a political ideology, and its ultimate aim is to establish a political state. But having said so, it seems to me, again, in all humility, that ultimate political state is rather vague at the moment. It depends on whether you're a liberal scholar or an academic or a conservative scholar. It also depends which one of the 4 sects in Islam that you belong to. Malaysia, we take the Sunni and then a subsect of Sufism, interpretation of that ultimate political state. And of course, I've read that some Muslim scholars say such a state have already come into being, giving the example of a state of Medina, and also during the time of the Caliphate. And of course, some say that during the time of Mughal Empire in India, and then today now there are 5 countries openly professing themselves to be Islamic states. In the Middle East, you have Saudi Arabia, Iran. In Africa, you have Sudan. And in the Indian subcontinent, of course, you have Pakistan and Afghanistan. The model as professed by these 5 countries, with greatest respect and humility, I don't think that model has a great following in this country, whether you're Muslim or a non-Muslim. Ultimately, human beings have come a long, long way. If you look through the system of government that has been experimented over the years, government can be distilled down to basically only 3 forms. 1, an autocracy, a rule of one man. Example, our Junior Kim in North Korea, for example, during the time of Idi Amin in Uganda, the present king of Saudi Arabia, Colonel Gaddafi. And then the second form of government is an oligarchy, a ruler of a few. And the best example we can see is the military junta in Burma. And then lastly, you have a democracy, rule of many. And I like that quotation given by Dr. Farooq. That sums it up. In fact, Winston Churchill says that democracy is a terrible form of government, something to that effect. He said, except all other forms that have been tried and tested are far more terrible. And on this score, we already settled it once and for all in 1957. My fellow colleague Malik Imtiaz mentioned that. We've forgotten about that. We look through at the different models of what kind of state and what kind of political system that we want to adopt now. And we came down with this model stated in 1957, reiterated in 1963 in the formation of Federation Malaysia, with the input of Sabah and Sarawak. And that itself now, given the complex, the multiracial, multi-religious setup of our country, a lot of compromise, a lot of thought has been given into it. And it came out with an excellent piece of paper called the Federal Constitution. And indeed, these are the few important elements in it. It's a constitutional monarchy, it's a parliamentary democracy, we have separation of powers, it's a federal system, the Constitution is supreme, we have a written Bill of Rights, and it's all undergirded by constitutionalism and the rule of law. And all citizens are equal citizens, sharing equally in that commonwealth. That has been settled many years ago. But I recognize as a constitutional lawyer, the Constitution is not static. It evolves with the time. And a recent debate is basically a political debate, came about in the early 80s when Dr. M became the Prime Minister of this country. And that's for political reason and political consumption. And we have to go back to revive, to change altogether this constitution. I think the subject matter is a matter of honor, it's a matter of honesty, it's a matter of integrity. It is something that our forefathers, our founding fathers have already shook hands upon, agreed on that mutual covenant in 1957, reiterated in 1963. Why 55 years later, we reopen this debate? In a democracy, we recognize it is a rule of majority, but bearing in mind, there's such thing as a protection of the rights of minority. To reopen it, to shift it to a different model, I think is a matter of honor and honesty at issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dato' Kenny Eng. There you are again, the emphasis on the federal constitution. And those of you who are interested in this area to see how the early documents that brought about our federal constitution spoke on this very subject of the type of state that we have established, just look at two documents, the Reid Commission report and the constitutional proposals called the White Paper based on the Reid report. If I'm not mistaken, paragraph 57 spoke specifically of a secular state in Malaysia. Anyway, there you have it, and it's an interesting debate. And let's move on to another viewpoint. And we heard two lawyers. The next commentary is coming from a politician, our distinguished commentator, Dr. Mujahid Yusof Rawa. I now call on him to speak.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera dan peace be upon you. As we mentioned, I've got only 5 minutes to speak. I don't know whether walking here also include 5 minutes. Let me tell you just this simple point. Number one, I agree totally with what Dr. Farouk mentioned about the concept of Islamic State. Although there were some points that I disagree when he talked something about parts. Now, I would rather see this discussion readjust the topic as not Islamic State, but Islam and the state. What is important, because if we put the word Islamic State, we will be indulged into discussing the format. I'm here to discuss on the substance, because I believe Islam is for all period of time, and as a believer, no one can question me that. And part of my belief in my faith, state is also part of my belief. So here, we should be more discussing on the substance rather than the form. It doesn't matter whether Saudi is an Islamic state or not, although they ruin all the holy places. It doesn't matter whether Iran is an Islamic state or not, although they do not give freedom. What matters most is, how does Islam interpret politics, democracy, and how it can be part of the mainstream? Being a democratic country, Islamic Party has its long-standing history, especially my party, the Islamic Party. My father was the president of the party. I'm the second generation. Inshallah, my son and my daughter will be the third generation. And I would like also to state here that PAS as an Islamic Party is constitutional. It doesn't work the other way around. You may have different opinion on us, but that's okay. That's the beauty of it. That's why I'm here. Now, we come to the question of where does Islam stand in politics? Yes, Islam says a lot about democratic process. If you refer to the verses of Al-Quran in Surah Ali Imran, chapter 4, 159. Allah said, and Dr. Farooq mentioned that in his speech, that Islam reject authoritarian leadership. That's number one. You can talk about Islam or not, but that's number one. We reject authoritarian leadership. Walau kunta fazzan ghaliz al-qalb. O Muhammad, the Prophet, if your heart is filled with autocracy, no blessing, people will run away from you. Lam faddu min hawlik. Fa'fu anhum. The word may sound very simple. Bless them. But bless here means be democratic. Let people talk to you, listen their problem. Even you do not like them. But, listening is democracy. And then at the end of the ayah, Allah mentioned, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Discuss with them. And shura, as you know, whether it's compatible or not, can be also understood in a way or another, the democratic process of making decision. So here I think this is what we should be discussing. That's number one. So you can say whatever it is, Islamic State or what, we reject authoritarian leadership. We call for consultation. We call for discussion for the public. Number two, we should be discussing on how democracy can flourish justice. Democracy in itself is the best way to flourish justice. Because justice is part of the Islamic teaching. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Al-Ma'idah, chapter 6, ayah number 8, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kunu qawamina lillah, shuhada'a bil qist, wa la yajrimannakum shana'anu qawmin, ala alla ta'dilu, i'dilu huwa aqrabu litaqwa. Oh, the believers. The politicians, me or those who are Muslim politicians should be the believers, as much as the Christian politician or other politician should be the believers, not just a simple politician who just wants their voice to be heard or who wants to become a YB. That's not the issue. That's the ring. Did I hear it right? Right. Okay. So what we do here is to erect justice. And democracy can give that justice. I come back to the second question. Whose responsibility? Not my party, not PKR, not UMNO, of course, and not others. If you ask me this simple question, I tell you the answer is you. You are responsibility to make sure whatever this country wants to be. That's your problem. As far as it is constitutional, has been mentioned by my good friend, lawyer, as far as it is constitutional, fine, do it. But number one, stop autocracy. Number two, fight corruption. Number three, create leaders who are responsible for the people. And number four, which is very important, you must fight racism in whatever form it is. So, just let me conclude, because I know he will just ring the bell for the second time. I would just say this. It is important to establish freedom and democracy rather than discussing whether it is an Islamic state or not. The people should be given good life. And the political leaders should be discussing on how to improve good governance and improve livelihood. This is the utmost important thing. Why are you talking about hudud? People go and steal because the government does not give us good life. People must be given good life. There are no reason for people to steal. So, and then the understanding of when you say about Islamic State or hudud, I think this is terrible. Even the Chinese